Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. As the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth visits Poland, global attention turns to Russia-Ukraine peace talks and concerns that Kyiv and Europe could be sidelined in negotiations. With Trump's direct outreach to Putin, European leaders have voiced alarm over potential US concessions. Joining us is David Dunn, Professor of International Politics at the University of Birmingham, to discuss the implications for Ukraine, NATO and Poland's strategic role in shaping Europe's response. Professor, welcome to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. So, high-powered delegations from around the world, nowhere more so than from the United States. Yes, we've got J.D. Vance, we've got Pete Hegseth, and we've got others attending. What does this tell us, if anything, about the US's approach or ambitions with the war in Ukraine?
Well, it shows that the Americans are finally turning their attention to it, having more or less said nothing for the first 3 weeks of the administration. But it also shows a desire on the part of Mr. Trump to, in a sense, have him stand aside from delivering the bad news. He's there in Washington lauding his talks with Mr. Putin, and yet he's leaving Hegseth and others to deliver what is effectively an abandonment of the Ukraine by virtue of the fact that the Americans have engaged in preemptive concessions to the Russians, saying that Ukraine will not be allowed into NATO, that it can't hope to get back its 2014 borders, that any peacekeeping troops in Ukraine will not involve American soldiers, and indeed that any troops sent to Ukraine will not be protected by the Article 5 NATO security guarantee. So all of those things are major preemptive concessions to the Russians before the negotiations are even supposed to have started. So there are many people in Europe across the piece who are regarding this as an act of appeasement of the Russians and as a remarkably inept and naive negotiating strategy on behalf of the Americans. So there was a great deal of disquiet in European capitals and indeed within the US as well. Senator Schiff described this as a cack-handed approach to negotiations, and can't believe that what the Americans have done in effectively betraying the interests of Ukraine and betraying the promises that America has made over the last 3 years towards Ukraine.
Understood. Okay, so thanks for laying that out for us. Now, we're all familiar with Trump's approach. He does make rather controversial statements, and what we see turn out later ends up being somewhat more toned down than those statements might indicate. If one looks underneath the surface, for example, at a trade deal that Trump is prepared to do with Ukraine for rare earths, minerals and so on, is there a possibility that actually, he expects to be able to guarantee the source of supply of those rare earths, if for nothing else, for American security of supply? Otherwise, he risks giving China control over all of those.
Well, I understand the Ukrainians have put this to him, recognizing the transactional nature of Mr. Trump, suggesting that they can have access and preferential access to rare earth materials in Ukraine. But of course, Mr. Trump is also exploring annexing Greenland because of the rare earth materials there. So it's not as if he has one source of supply, nor is it indeed that he has any coordinated, strategic, well-worked out approach to either the security of Europe or indeed the supply of these materials. What we're seeing, I think, over the last 3 weeks is a series of Trump speaking from the hip, as one commentator has described it, or opening his mouth before engaging his brain, effectively, in terms of actually having a clear idea of where he ends up. He is a disruptor. He actually uses weaponized uncertainty to try and wrong foot all his interlocutors, apart from Russia, that is, I think. And that is what we're seeing. So it's very difficult to actually judge his conduct, or indeed the conduct of his administration, by any of the previous metrics or indeed approaches that we have previous American or indeed other administrations, because there's so much uncertainty involved in the way in which this man does business.
Indeed, and we look forward to the fog clearing as actions actually take effect. Now, moving over to the European perspective, Trump has made it clear ever since his first term in office that he expects European countries to shoulder a bigger share of the burden of European defence, and he's repeating that now, and adding to that, of course, that Europe should take a bigger role in helping Ukraine than the US has done thus far. Is Europe ready for this?
I think what you say is absolutely right. And in a sense, it follows on from what the Biden administration and indeed the Obama administration have been saying to Europe. And the Europeans have been remarkably slow to do that. However, following the invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Europeans, through NATO, have pledged to spend more money on defence, and most of those nations have made good on those pledges. So there is an increase in defence spending and defence capability. However, it's not enough, and it's not enough if the Americans are effectively going to be unilaterally withdrawing an effective security guarantee to Europe, as seems to be the implication of what they're saying with regard to Ukraine. So there's a gap between the expectations, the reality and pace that Europe can fulfill those, and the pace at which the Americans seem to be wanting to remove the security presence in Europe. Of course, all of that comes at the same day as President Trump has given a press conference where he talks about halving the American defense budget as part of a coordinated arms control approach with Russia and China. So he's demanding that Europe pay 3%, or some say 5%, at the same time as they're paying 3.2%, and talking today about halving that to 1.5%. So again, trying to actually work out any sense of coherence in the Trump approach is a challenge.
Yes, although Pete Hegseth, of course, has lauded Poland for spending almost 5% and held Poland up as a role model for the rest of Europe. How influential can Poland be in getting other European countries and perhaps even other NATO countries to achieve, even the basic 2%, let alone the 5%?
Yes, I mean, Poland is the exemplar, and it's no surprise that Hegseth points to that. Of course, Poland spends more than as a percentage of GDP than the United States, even though the United States is involved in the Pacific as well as in the Atlantic and European theatres. But the expenditure within Europe varies, and it varies as a consequence of geography and history. For example, the Spanish, by virtue of their experiences with fascism and General Franco, are remarkably disinclined to spend more than 1.5% of GDP on defence. And of course, geographically, they're a long way away from Russia, and therefore don't see the threat in the same way that the frontline states like Poland and the Baltic states see Russia. And therefore, there's a job of persuasion to be done. So that there is that variation. But this can be done through NATO, it can be done through national targets, but it's not just how much, of course, is spent. It's about what that money buys, because one of the problems in Europe as a whole spends a great deal of money on defence, but it's spent very inefficiently. It's spent on creating national infrastructures and national force structures that are often inefficient in terms of the military punch that they deliver, and therefore, in a sense, a more coordinated approach to defence and defence procurement and a unified defence procurement are all necessary to make sure that any expenditure is well spent and results in serious capability rather than the appearance of capability and the appearance of spending.
Certainly, so it's not just about the amount, but it's also about the efficiency of spending. Now, you mentioned Spain as an outlier. Well, one could argue, yes, well, they might be far away from Russia, but they're still under the NATO umbrella, and therefore, they should be held responsible for paying for that protection. Is NATO at risk of disintegrating? Very, very briefly, if you would, sir.
There is a risk. There is a risk of that the American security guarantee to NATO is seen to be lacking in credibility, lacking in reassurance, and lacking in certainty. It could go one of two ways. NATO could become a busted flush, or this could be a spur to actually Europeans spending more money and taking their defence more seriously and making a more robust NATO as a consequence.
Understood. Professor Dunn, thank you very much for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good day, sir.
And you.
Thank you. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.